Hello. Welcome to Aligning Tier 1 and Special Education on Purpose. My name is Deb Hanmer, founder and CEO of Breakthrough Leadership Consulting. Breakthrough works with school leaders who want to be inspired to deliver impact. One of my passions in this work is designing systems of school culture and climate that support both students and teachers to love the educational experience. Breakthrough's signature program, Leaning into School Culture, is working in schools around the country and helping leaders to understand that they absolutely can create the climate in their buildings. I'm joined today by my colleague, Michelle Hess. I'll let Michelle introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Michelle. I am the founder of Included Consulting, who I work with school leaders who want to serve all students through an inclusive lens.
Thanks, Michelle. Michelle and I worked together for many years, tackling the needs of students from what might be considered different angles. I was in charge of all the school culture stuff, ensuring that the overall school community was operating as it should. Teachers had tools to manage their classrooms effectively. Routines and systems were operating across the school. Incentives were happening. That teachers were communicating with parents, all of that stuff. Michelle was in charge of special education, very specialized stuff for a very specific group of students, as it can sometimes feel within schools and districts. Michelle and I figured out, though, how planning and partnership across the tier one components of the work and special education could really deliver stronger outcomes for all involved. You know, Michelle, one thing I always say is this: there have always been students who need more support to make strides in school. That's not new. Sometimes the conversation these days makes it seem like it is.
No.
The hard truth is that many of our schools are dealing with more student cases at the individual level of student support because they have not invested in consistent, proactive programming and supports that could prevent or mitigate a variety of challenges experienced in schools. We call those universal supports, tier one. So, universal supports are those approaches and practices we have put in place because we understand the student population that we serve, and we are not willing to wait and see how the year goes or which students show up. We know that there will always be students who be having a rough morning, use language that is undesired at school, resolve conflicts with their hands, struggle to control emotions, just get frustrated when taking a
Mhm.
test, are late to class. Um, we know that because we work with humans. And some of those same behaviors are certainly true for us as adults working with children.
Absolutely. And often those students, because of their individual needs, can end up taking a disproportionate amount of time and energy from teachers and school leaders.
Exactly. We could tell some stories if we
Oh,
had
yeah.
time.
Oh, yeah.
And let's be honest, it can be frustrating.
Mhm.
Sometimes it even feels unfair to us as the adults. I've worked with so many schools. I worked in so many schools where the burnout from these involved student cases is so real.
Yeah. And what can often happen, or what sometimes happens, is that schools then default into referring students to special education, not because the student needs an IEP necessarily, but because the tier one programming just isn't there. And so, in other words, the right systems or those strong tier one practices, they aren't happening for any students.
Yep. You're hitting it right on the head. That's the heart of it. The real issue is that many schools are reacting at the individual level because they haven't built consistent, proactive tier one programming. Um, when I think of sort of the strongest culture and climate schools that I've worked in, right? Schools have things like morning meeting, right? Or an advisory period, we sometimes call it, for our middle schoolers or high schools. There's social skills happening, right? There's some fixed time for social skills learning for students. There's some kind of practice around mindfulness, right? And I don't mean, it doesn't have to be a full yoga program, but just working with kids and practicing how to take deep breaths or stretch breaks, right? Things to regulate their emotions. Um, there are routines in place to help students practice how to organize themselves and their
Mhm.
time. Things like even talk it out tables. That's something, we used at a school together, right?
Yeah.
Places for like kids to learn to sort of resolve problems that come up
Mhm.
in class for them. Um, so nothing, none of these things they're small things, right? They're actually big things, even though
Yeah.
they're these individual practices, but they're big when you kind of group them together. Um, you group them together to create that those tier one programming and supports.
Yeah. And I really appreciate that framing because without those tier one supports, special education can end up being kind of a catch all for
Yep.
students whose needs could have been addressed earlier or could have been addressed more holistically at that tier one level. Or, quite frankly, could have been addressed in a more inclusive way versus through a special ed support.
Yeah. And, there are students and it's the way it should be. There are students who need those specialized services and we want them to get those specialized services, right? And so, when people on my side of the on my side in the aisle, if you will, right, are kind of doing um strong work in creating those robust tier one tier one programs and interventions for the kiddo who's having the rough morning, right? Maybe that doesn't turn into something where the only outlet for that child or the only sort of thing they consistently practice is kind of having a real emotional struggle, which, after so many times ends up leading to like, oh, maybe there's a deeper issue that we want to look at. And those are real things how
Mhm.
kind of students um move through the day and work through kind of these frustrations and that environment that we create around them can really help, right? So that's why having schools embed things like, again, morning meeting, advisory, these mediation tables uh can be just so strong.
Yeah. And um I always think about we always had win the morning at our
Mm,
in our schools, and I think about like for students with identified needs or unidentified specialized
yes.
needs yet, right? When those foundations are not in place, um then everybody seems like they need help, right? Because the tier one support isn't there. When you do have a really strong tier one programming, a tier one morning meeting program, tier one
Yeah.
SEL curriculum, recess and lunch routines, right? Then you can start to identify even more clearly the students who need individualized support because they stand out more clearly. And you can really start to clarify, at the classroom level which students can be served at that tier one broad level and which students need a little bit more. And then that makes special education not just about compliance, but
Mm,
about capacity and
mm.
how you serve students within the context of their learning environment.
Yeah. And that context, that environment, that learning
Mhm.
environment that you're talking about, Michelle. I mean, when we are really sort of looking at classrooms, like thinking about like how they're set up, how they stimulate students or calm
Mhm.
students, even the smells in the environment, right? Like if we taken into account like, getting trash out of the room at the right cadence and schedule, all those things impact that learning experience for students. And one of the things I've noticed over the years, right? And I'm sure many folks listening have a similar experience, right? It's sort of that environment that we set around students can really change
Mhm.
behavior, right? Like when they walk into a calm space, a space that has that written schedule on the board that isn't, again, and this is one of the things I feel like I learned from you, right? Like we love visuals in education, we
Oh
love
yeah.
anchor charts, but sometimes it can be overly stimulating. There's
Mhm.
too many things up on the walls, right? So even being able, like, and working together, right, with those who kind of understand those specialized needs more, it kind of really gives us feedback at that tier one level of how we can be thinking about all students all the time as we set up environments and spaces in our classes.
Yeah. And that's such a good point because I feel like when schools think about tier one programming, they think about, okay, what's our code of conduct? What is our
Yep.
discipline system? How are we going to basically make sure that there are rules and routines in the classroom? And that is absolutely part of a tier one program. But it's not just the reactive stuff, right? If you're only thinking about code of conduct and discipline, that could mean that you're kind of stuck in this reactive mode versus thinking about what the real setup of a tier one program is proactive. You've mentioned a lot
Yes.
of those things already: routines, morning meeting. Another one is school wide incentives, classroom incentives. How do kids feel when they come into the school building, to get them that foundation for learning?
Yeah. And that's why, having this conversation right now, Michelle, was so exciting for me because this is the opportunity. We're still, like schools, I know we open around the country at different times. Some schools are actually a week away from opening at the time that we're recording this. Some
Yep.
have a little bit of runway to go. But that idea of like how we can proactively plan for our students because we know the things that challenge students, we know the things that help support students in their environment. That's what's really exciting to me about tier one and thinking about again how tier one interacts and supports students up
Yes.
and down up and down the spectrum of needs, right? That if we use this time now proactively to map out that strong plan, not just make sure we have our code of conduct, that we really are setting our students up for success, whether they are in general education or special education.
Yeah. And when schools can do that, those schools are able to support the most students possible at the tier one level so that again, those students who really need those individualized supports can get them.
Yes, yes. No, thanks, Michelle. This has been a great conversation. And
Mhm.
I'm super excited to sort of continue the conversation as we think about this, you know, sort of focused in on some of the work you've done such an amazing job leading over the years as it relates to special education. So I hope folks will be able to join us for part two of this conversation. Again, focused in on tier one and special education working together on purpose. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Deb.